Some of you have come up from Zoar, and you've been added to by friends of ours here who have been anxious to see this. This has been a show that has been matriculating from the fall last year to February and March this year. And I'm particularly happy that Larry Waldman has agreed to take on this specific opportunity to share with you Tim and Don Whitmire's vision of the city they loved and worked in and were a part of that community, and how it affected their own immersion in the art that was created there. Additionally, Marianne Berardi has joined us. Marianne and Larry are two very distinguished scholars of American art and Ohio art in particular. And Marianne is the scholar of record for George Adamite. So having the two of them here to share their knowledge of this and to reflect on these objects that form the Whitmire's collection is a rare opportunity. So thank you all very much for coming, and I'll turn it over to the two of them.
Hi, I wanted to thank John. This started really 2 years ago, where he asked Henry Adams and I to write up about the Zoar Art Colony with the idea that we were going to do a show, which we are going to do a show for the bicentennial, in May at the Bimler House, which has been newly restored, which I think you all know about. And coincidental with that, the Whitmires decided to sell part of their collection, which they have put together over the years. Some of the pieces will be in that show. We do have, which many of you might know about, in the Ohio Historical Center's Timeline magazine. There's going to be a series of articles. The first two have already appeared. The first one on the religious background, which showed up in January. Then Kathy Fernandez has done one about the actual history of the colony. And Henry Adams, who is a renowned American art historian. Unfortunately, he is now in Connecticut, so he couldn't be here today. And we've done a magazine on the art colony. It's been an interesting research and background into it, and really what I'd like to talk today is intertwining two things. One, the Zoarites were known as separatists, and the second, the art colony, which started around the 1880s and continued very strongly through the 1930s and 40s. One can say it even continued to this day, with the Whitmires sponsoring their art contest every year at Zoar. And the artists, especially at the beginning, called themselves successionists. And I think there was, looking at the research, and the main thing I wanted to leave you with today, in addition to talking about some of the individual paintings, is why there was this close connection, this kind of kindred spirit between the artists and the Zoarites. You can go back almost like we do now with genealogy in a family tree to the 1800s. And it touches on something which we're all very much dealing with today, and that's the effect of industrialization. And the Zoarites, as many of you know, since you're descendants of the family, and I'm going to try and be careful to see how many mistakes I make, but started in Württemberg, Germany, really in the later part of the 1700s. One can trace it back to the end of the 30 Years' War. I rather trace it back more to the Napoleonic era and all the upheavals that were made. And many of you know about this, but for some of you who don't, Württemberg was, after the 30 Years' War, given over to the Lutherans and a certain royal family. And they became both the state and the church-sponsored state. And they had very strict ideas that if you were baptized, you were not just baptized into the Lutheran faith, you were also made a member of the state. So there was that close connection. The children had to go to school where they were indoctrinated with, that's probably too strong a word, but that's how they viewed it, with certain ideas of the state and religion, and so forth. And a lot of the individuals living in that duchy at the time really reacted to that. They wanted their own spiritual belief, their own spiritual relationship with God, and not have it dictated by the church, which in many ways they thought was corrupt, and the duchy, who they did not feel should be above them. There was even arguments in German if you call someone informally du versus the formal Sie. And so there was that. And it was very tough, because if they didn't send their children to the Christian school, if they didn't attend church services, they could be flogged or put to jail, and several of them were abused. They struggled with this. They needed permission, and finally in 1817, about 300 were given permission to come to America and flee what they felt was a very oppressive regime. Now, around that same time, after the upheavals in the 1800s of the Napoleonic War, and with industrialization, a lot of individuals, especially the artists, rebelled against what they felt was the life that was being transformed from the pure Eden-like agrarian life to the industrial life, where you had a lot of pollution with the coal factories, the development of the slums, people coming out of the farms and having kind of the Dickinsonian poor relationship. But at the same time, art was taught in a lot of the academies, which also had a very strict formal training in terms of how you were supposed to do paintings. And a lot of the artists rebelled against this. The reason successionists is because they weren't invited to the formal art shows, and so they would develop their own art shows. So where the artists were rebelling against this kind of strict establishment from the art community, the Zoarites were rebelling against the strict establishment of the church community. When the Zoarites came to America, they were sponsored by the Quakers in Philadelphia. They stayed there short term. There was some argument. The Quakers wanted to sell them land in western Pennsylvania. And there was a Moravian who had such a deal, some good land in Ohio. Now, one thing I don't know is if it was planned already, the canal. This is 1817. I know the canal really only comes into its own in the late 1820s. So whether it was luck or kind of shrewd business practices that they ended up settling, because that really made the difference and made it a successful community right on the canal.
They were shrewd. It was a second. They were shrewd.
Yeah, they were shrewd, okay. And this is because we have the descendants here who will say that. What I think is fabulous is that they were more than shrewd. They were very democratic. 300 originally came, 53 men, 104 women, and 143 children, 18, 17, 18. So right from the beginning, by necessity, they had to have something, not just the men, but everybody, all the adults, signing the compact, because they understood if they were to survive, that they all had to work together. And it was very rough. They have some log cabins. Many of you have grown up there, much less visited, but if you haven't been there, go there. It is just incredible. I won't go into depth about the garden and the town itself, other how marvelous it is. But they had to have a communal organization to survive. And so the children were all looked after. The men and women were given chores. They sounded a horn at the beginning of the day, is my understanding. And they would come and see who was going to go to the dairy, who was going to go to the fields, who was going to go to the blacksmith, the mills, and whatever. But right from the beginning, location was wonderful. When the canal came, the canal men asked, well, we need a place to stay. So they had a small hotel which eventually got expanded. The local farmers would come there with their wheat and other crops to be milled, put on the canal boats. They could either send it up to Cleveland to put on ships for Europe or go all the way down the canal, the Ohio River, Mississippi, to go over. So they really had this wonderful business network. They opened up a store right away. I have the flour mill was 1820. The store was 1833. And by the way, the tavern is 1829. Is that right? Which John has, and I think if none of you have been there, someone has to be there. I mean, the best food in the world. I mean, it is just unbelievable. And what is it called in the basement, the tavern?
The Rathskeller.
The Rathskeller, where it was cool.
It was a refrigerator.
It was a refrigerator. So they really developed a community which was shared among themselves with equal kind of votes and responsibility, but also was wonderful business sense that they were really using all their relationships around the community, the transportation, and everything else. Now, unfortunately, the other thing that happened is the corrupting influence of modern life. Because this gentleman, Mr. Gunn, was the first outsider. I haven't gone into the German community. The kids learned German in school. It was really a German-speaking ambience and culture. Mr. Gunn was a wonderful, also successful industrialist. He wrote a diary, and in the diary he says, "Here comes faintly the echoes of strife. Well was it named Zoar, the place of rest. Here too I come and find sanctuary from the clamors and empty ambitions of the world." Unfortunately, he brought those with him. He rented a cabin or bought a cabin. He mainly stayed at the hotel, which is interesting. But the cabin, he had his friend come down from Cleveland, and they had these kind of raucous parties and drank beer and had a wonderful time. Well, what happened with the train coming in the 1880s and the hotel expanding and all these wealthy people from Cleveland, I think from Pittsburgh, surrounding areas come down there, everyone said, what are we doing here when there's all this fancy stuff going on outside? And it had kind of a corrupting influence on the society. And around the 1890s, they finally had to dissolve it. What's been wonderful, because it was kind of in a remote area, it stayed pristine. And so much of the buildings and just the layout of the town, the garden, was preserved. We were just talking about some of the things developed in Cleveland, which at that point may have been farmland, but has since all been raised and you can't even recognize the area. Now, what happened also, going back to this industrialization, there was a mood for plein air painting outside. And it was really popularized in the 1890s when two of Monet's famous Impressionist paintings of haystacks were exhibited in Cleveland. A local industrialist had bought them and they were shown, and it became the rage that everyone had to go out. We see this wonderful painting by Adam Lair, which is over here, of the haystacks by Zoar. And let's go out and paint. And haystacks, you really, if you had a house, you had to have a haystacks painting over the fireplace, and it became the rage. And then you see this painting here, which is kind of wonderful, by Adamite, one of the first students to come down there, is of Mr. Gunn in his garden next to the Hermitage. The early style of the art from the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s really was impressionistic. And you have several paintings on this wall, all of that style, mostly by Adamite. The students who came down there at first all were commercial artists. So Adamite started an engraving firm, Caxton, which lasted for the next 40, 50 years. They did a lot of catalogs for White Motors, General Electric, all the big firms in Cleveland. And then on the summers, weekends, he would go and do his fine art. And so many of the artists, Beely included, were really commercial artists who worked for all the big firms, from Standard Oil to Westinghouse to Alcoa, doing artwork and running small businesses. Cleveland is unique in the sense that all the other city art communities were founded around a museum, whether the Metropolitan in New York, Pennsylvania School of Fine Arts in Boston. Cleveland was founded around an art school which was geared toward industrial commercial art. So the artists were doing two things. One, they were very well versed in what's sold in the commercial world, but also to do that, they had to be cutting edge in terms of what the latest styles were. And their art tended to reflect that and tended to be very avant-garde in terms of their approach. Beely, who we'll talk about in a minute, worked for 30 years for a firm which was the #1 seller of movie posters. These were cranked out every week. And the movie posters could be this size, or they could be these huge billboards which you see along the highway. And the idea is, if you're coming by your trolley car or train, it had to really click right away and give the message. And there is that very modernistic style to all of Beely's designs, which are really quite remarkable. So you had these individuals come. Gottwald was the first one, who was a teacher at the art school, and would bring about 20 students down every summer, and they would stay in the old schoolhouse. And again, with the corrupting influence, Kathy Fernandez found that the children were given permission to miss their chores in school, because if they helped the artists, they had to carry these big easels to the fields and the umbrellas. They were given 25 cents, which was, if you imagine, the 1880s, 1890s, a lot of money. So what are we doing here? Working so hard, you know, doing hay and harvesting and milking cows and stuff, and look what we can do there. And it shows kind of the relationship. But they loved the artists being down there. It was wonderful. Some very famous artists were in the area. And one group after another were trained. First it was Gottwald, and then later Cullen Yates, who brought groups of students down there. So that's kind of the background. And there was a sense of oneness between the artists and the Zoarites, in the sense that they both felt they were recoiling from this industrial controlling world of regimes and going back to a simpler Edenic time, and how they kind of cooperated together, and the two things fit together. This is interesting. We still haven't figured out. There were unknown artists. No one knows who he is. It's a marvelous thing of one of the mill. Which mill is this, John? Do we know?
I don't know, Scott. It was the one over the canal.
We don't know if they did the flour or...
Yeah, they did flour there.
This is the flour mill and things. Huge structures and very well built. Probably just a later Impressionist style. We can walk in the other room now and look at some of the paintings. This is more or less the Beely room, even though we do start with one wonderful Adamite of one of the early Zoarite farmers. and then a later one by Beely, where you can tell by the clothing, it looks from the 30s, of one of the workers. Looking around at the Beelys, one thing that's very interesting, they are landscapes, but you can also think of them as self-portraits. And what do I mean by that? Is when Beely, he tended to be a very quiet man and was not very verbal with his feelings. But when you look at the moods he's conveying in each portrait, you get a sense, in each painting, a sense of how he's feeling at the time. And some things are a sense like of this central, beautiful watercolor, a sense of loss, a sense of kind of sadness, the cloudy days, the texture. Then to the left with the bright colors and the more cheery thing. And so you can look at them partly as just beautiful scenes, or you can start getting a sense of what he felt about the land and nature in kind of a spiritual sense. The other thing with Beely, talking about the very modern style of the artist, and we have some on this wall and some here, is he's really, in a very modern sense, reducing the views of the buildings, especially the architecture, really almost like Andy Warhol, to very abstract shapes. And you're really seeing doors and windows, but you're also seeing geometric forms and a certain kind of composition, and really looking in a more painterly style. Whether you look here, windows looking through to the outside world, and this kind of symmetry in terms of how he's painting it. Some of you may recognize this. This is the inside of cabin 1, and there's a large oil of that the society owns, which will be on display. He first would do this in the 1940s. He would stay at the cabin. Gus knows him well. They kind of grew up together, and I understand even dated each other's sisters and so forth. But that's a view when he was able in the 40s to stay there. Then what I want to do is just a few more minutes go in the other room, because the Whitmeyers did a wonderful thing collecting art from these competitions that took place. And you all may recognize the different views of the hotel, the schoolhouses, and even here with the garden and the garden house. So rather than focus too much, what I'd rather do is open it up to some questions about either the painting or the art colony or the school, and see what questions or thoughts anyone has.
Well, you did a good job on the Zoar history.
Yeah, I've been planning it and
We're
stuff.
going to make you an honorary Zoar.
That's always better than the Mickey Mouse Club and stuff. But I got to get one of those stars to wear and everything, right? Rather than everything.
Larry, I missed it.
Yeah.
Was Beely born in Zoar?
No. Beely was actually the background. It's hard to know what to go into. The family, the father and uncle, came from that area, not Württemberg, but their area of Germany, came here in the 1870s and 80s to decorate the millionaire homes on Euclid Avenue. And they were decorative artists. And they did a lot of the murals for the dining room, the ceilings, and things like that. So Beely was born here, and they, as most of the artists, he was sent back to Europe and studied at the Royal Academy in Munich around 1900 for the first time, and then the second time, which is this interesting work, around 1912. And the reason this is interesting is this kind of reflects much of what was happening with early European art, whether with the Blue Rider School and Kandinsky or with Matisse. And if you look at the blue outline and the type of coloring, the very kind of wet, impressionist look of it, it's The Road to Zoar. It's a painting he did often, but this is one of his earliest ones from 1920. And he was very versed in really the cutting edge. When he came here, he got a job at Otis Lithography and worked as a lithographer for the next 30 years, primarily doing movie posters, some circus posters, things like that. In the late teens, he went to Zoar for the first time. He had a big show in Cleveland in 1920, very well received. This was part of it, of his Zoar paintings, and he would continue to return there. Now, in the other room, there was a lithograph at the May Company, not May Company, at the May Show of Cleveland, 1923. He did a large watercolor of the old mill, which won first prize. And it was so popular, he did a series of lithographs, which are multiples in pencil, which is of the old, of the room. We're going to have one of his large, at the Bimler show, oil paintings of the mill, which is just great. So he became very attached to Zoar, and really from around 1920 through the 50s would go back there regularly, first by himself, then later with his family. In these original paintings, it was feeling he was very in a good mood and remembering his student days in Munich, because Zoar and the surrounding area reminded him of his open-air plain painting as a student. Later, in the Depression, when things became bad, you see, it was a struggle. A lot of his pictures have a different tone to them. There's more clouds, there's more moodiness, and it's almost, you get a sense of a longing for things that went by. Now, there's a parallel there because the community ended in the 1890s, so everyone was feeling, and some paintings you see from that area, you see the weathered look of the buildings. It was a hard life it was reflecting. They were in disarray, and the paintings reflect kind of the mood from the 30s and 40s. And the early ones have much more of a cheery, not one for one, but a cheery feel. But this really is from that. And so he became very much closely associated with Zoar because he had spent so much time and felt so much at one and knew so much of the people. They were closely connected.
We also went out to someplace west of Cleveland called Berlin Heights.
Berlin Heights, a little, that had been done with Henry Keller around 1917 and 18. He studied there with it. But that was kind of just briefly, and Keller was another important teacher and influence, but had an art school really out west by Berlin, Ohio, Berlin Heights. But really his main passion was Zoar, where it was kind of a home away from home. Again, they were all German background, German speaking. The whole culture, from the food to the outlook, was very comfortable for them. Other things about different, yes?
There was an artist in Cleveland for a while named Otto Henry Bacher.
Yes.
Did he have any connection there? He was German-American?
He was a little earlier because Otto Bacher was like a generation sooner, from around the 1870s to 1880s. He actually had gone over to that.
William Summer. Do you know if he ever went down to Zoar?
We're not sure. I've looked into it. I don't know if Summer was ever down that way. He was so caught up in Brandywine that I didn't see him really traveling anywhere else in Ohio. He just kind of was. And then, of course, you know, in those days they were working 6 days a week. And he was spending 4 hours a day, 2 hours each way, traveling between Brandywine on the tram to work here. So he didn't have much time to go far afield. But there was quite a large group of them that over the years went down there. We'll have more in a wider selection at the Bimler House. with that, women as well as men. And at that point, it was a big opportunity for women. The Cleveland School of Art was first set up as a school of industrial design for women, because that was one thing in the 1880s and later women could do. Some of you may know the story that the main woman who designed all the Tiffany lamps came from Cleveland, and she had not been known, that all the famous dragon lamps and daffodils and everything was actually a woman who worked for Tiffany. He did not do the lamps, he did do the glass, but she did the design work. So women were doing a lot of crafts for the home. It was a commercial age, designing everything from the pottery, Roseville and Rookwood, to China. But they also worked in the movie posters, doing a lot of the etching and design work there. So it was predominantly a school for women, became more balanced over the time. But in the summer schools going down to Zoar, I'd say it was about 15 women to 5 men and doing it. And we have some of the women artists who just did fabulous work, many of which, for one reason or another, have been forgotten over time, but played a very important role. And it was just an area where they could get training, but also could get work and be independent in those days, the turn of the century. Yes?
Was Bealey the most prolific in terms
Yes.
of imagery of Zoar?
Absolutely, I'd say 100 to 1.
Yeah.
So with Jika, for example, he was there in 1930s. We've identified 6 pieces. With Bealey, I think there's somewhere between 400 and 500 works of art. Yeah, no, it's staggering. This is just a small thing. I should have mentioned Fred Bealey, who's the grandson, really has been instrumental in a lot of what we're doing down at Zoar. He lives in New York, and they have the Bealey archives. And I visit him. He's just a wonderful fellow. He's an architect, and drawers and drawers and drawers, because the artists loved to sketch all the time. Of course, I always tell my sons, this is not just before television, it was before radio. And what would you do? You had to entertain yourself somehow. And these artists just were in the habit. And he said even in the 40s and 50s, when he knew his grandfather, he always had a pencil with him, a pad, colored pencils, and would draw. If the grandchildren would come in here, let me sketch you. But during this period when they were there a whole summer, he was, if you can imagine, and they were very quick. I mean, they could knock off a sketch, certainly in a couple hours, and even sometimes even less time like that. So they might have 3, 4, 5 watercolors or sketches a day. And you see kind of the change from a more traditional impressionistic work, which is more realistic, to more and more abstract, where they're really looking at geometric volumes, and they're looking at color and shape and how it interacts with things. But yeah, I mean, Bealey was bar none.
Bill has a Jika here, doesn't he? He showed you?
No, not here.
Oh,
No, it'll be at the show. No.
Okay, okay.
Here we have some wonderful Adamites, and then of course all the Bealeys are great. And then the more recent artists at the Whitmire, who have worked in a whole range of modern techniques and doing things really quite wonderful. What?
You can go back and see the balance.
Well, I think they've seen it. I wasn't going to comment on that so much, and just stick with these, the Zoars. Well, thanks. Hopefully it's been
Larry.
entertaining.